Okay, our next guest is Dan Lynn Watt. And Dan, you wrote a memoir about growing up in a communist family.
That's right. That's right.
And it was a very interesting memoir. What did you expect to do? Did you want to dig into yourself? Did you want to talk about history? What did you want to do?
Well, I called the book History Lessons
Yes.
because I found out as I was starting to write these stories that became the book, I found out that many people who I was sharing with did not know this history. And therefore, it seemed to me that there was, and this is not ancient history, this is mid 20th century American history. And many people did not know about what it was like to be a communist, what the communists experienced in this country, what was like to grow up in that kind of milieu. So that's what I was trying to show, what it was like to grow up in that
Yeah,
subculture.
you talk about your parents. I think one of the things I want to say is this great admiration for your father comes through, right?
Yes, and that's one of the interesting things about the book, because also my father, being a hero, was a difficult thing for me to deal with as I got older, because the expectation that I had of myself was that I would somehow learn to be heroic like he was, but I didn't feel heroic.
Yeah. So you grew up like in the 40s, and you were hounded by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and the House Un-American Activities Committee, and you felt that your apartment, your house was bugged, right?
Absolutely. We had a saying in our family, the walls have ears. And it was literally true in our case, because the FBI had bugged our house. And so there were certain things we never, ever talked about. Even though we talked about our political ideas, and my parents all talked about their political views, but what they didn't talk about was where somebody was, or anything that would help the FBI find someone, or there was nothing hidden about what they believed.
Yes.
But the things that were hidden were some of the activities.
Now, your father had to go off to Mexico for about 3 years, and was in 1951 when you were, I think, 11 years old or so. Tell us why.
My father went to Mexico. First, he went to try to find places for American communists to go if the Communist Party in this country was going to be outlawed. They thought that American communists would have to have some place to escape to. So one of his trips, early trips to Mexico, actually our whole family went to Mexico in 1948 on what appeared to be a vacation, and was a vacation. But my father was scouting for places for American communists to hide. And he was in process of helping one of the communist leaders who had been convicted of conspiracy to teach and advocate the overthrow of the government under a law called the Smith Act. Right. He was helping that man escape to Mexico when they were apprehended. And the Mexican police captured this man that was with my father, and took him back to the United States and turned him over to the FBI. But my father just sort of had to lay low. They didn't take him, they let him go. And he didn't feel like he could return to the United States for quite a while. And during that time, of course, I had no idea where he was. In fact, that was one of the defining periods of my life, was from age 11 to 13, I did not know where my father was. Right. It was not a case where, my parents had separated. It wasn't that at all. It was just a case where he had left home so that he could continue the work of the communist movement somewhere else. And yes, go ahead.
So we're going to listen to you read in just right now.
At dawn on April 4th, 1938, George Watt, fighting for the glorious but doomed cause of the Spanish Republic, reached the west bank of the Ebro River. The river was wide, freezing cold, flowing swiftly at the height of the spring flood. 8 men fleeing from Franco's fascist army knew they'd be imminently discovered. They had to get across the river. They could not find a boat, and the bridges had all been blown up. 5 men made a makeshift raft from a barn door. My father and 2 others said they'd swim. The raft vanished downstream around a bend in the river. The swimmers stripped off their clothes and plunged into the river, letting the current carry them while they swam across. My father and his friend Johnny Gates reached the other side, shivering, and walked until they came to a road. A jeep came along carrying 2 American journalists. The men in the jeep tossed George and Johnny a couple of blankets and asked to hear their story. The journalists were Herbert Matthews of the New York Times and Ernest Hemingway, reporting from Spain for the North American News Agency. The next day, the story appeared on the front page of the New York Times. All through my childhood, I met people who told me, George Watt is my hero. When he swam the Ebro River, he made the front page of the New York Times. After escaping across the Ebro, George was appointed political commissar of the Lincoln Battalion. At 24, he was one of the leading American communists in Spain. He remained a dedicated communist for the next 20 years, including the worst years of anti-communist repression in this country. I'm a red diaper baby, a child of communist parents. My grandparents on both sides, my aunts and uncle, were all communists as well. I grew up knowing that my father was a hero who had risked his life for the cause.
So we're talking with Dan Lynn Watt. This is New England Authors, and so you're talking about how you grew up as a communist. You denied to your friends that your parents were communists. Is that right?
I never wanted to talk about it. Yeah. I tried not to deny, but I never acknowledged, and it didn't seem to matter to the people I was with. They never thought anything about it. Most of the other children who I played with or the students I went to school with did not have any idea about this, and I did not enlighten them.
Right, okay.
But I want to say something else that one of the other aspects of my childhood was this strong idealism that I learned as a child. I learned about opposing racism. I learned about opposing war. I learned about economic injustice, about labor unions, and about the idea of people not being treated fairly. Yeah. And that was very important to me growing up as well. So I wanted to espouse those ideals.
Yes. Now, looking back on what lesson did you learn from your parents as communists? And I want to, if you can possibly relate it to today's, with the rise of New England's Bernie Sanders and other people. Big question.
So the thing, I think there are 2 important things that I think that are kind of important themes of the book. And one of the themes is the ideals of my parents, the things they believed in, are still the things that people like Bernie Sanders are espousing and people on the left are espousing. Equality, racial equality, equality of everyone, all human beings, yeah. Men and women, that fair treatment. These were the ideals that I grew up with, and opposing Jim Crow, opposing racial discrimination, legal discrimination, and so all of that has stayed with me all my life, one way or another. And I did get actively involved in the civil rights movement as a young adult. What the other side of it, thing that I learned was my parents were kind of prisoners to their ideology.
Yes.
They had a certain set of blinders on. They believed certain things were true, and they were not open to evidence that those things were not true.
Yeah.
And for the most egregious in a way, was the belief that the Soviet Union was some kind of workers' paradise.
Yes.
And it was not at all a workers' paradise. So a huge, something that I had to cope with as a teenager was trying to keep the ideals that I was talking about and yet let go of the sort of Marxist-Leninist ideology that my parents had believed and had tried to inculcate in me. I called my book History Lessons for a few reasons. One is my parents believed in what they thought of as scientific study of history. They believed that they, following the teachings of Karl Marx and Lenin and Stalin, that they knew what was going to happen in history, and that the study of history proved the inevitability of the class struggle, the inevitability of the working class becoming triumphant. And this was how they looked at the world. So they lived in history, and they believed they were making history. And they were making history. Another reason for the title is that when I started working on this and sharing it with other writers and friends, many people said to me, I don't know anything about this. I was alive. Many of them were alive at the same time I was. But I don't know anything about this. I didn't know what it was like to be a communist. I didn't know what it was like to live through that. So I'm sharing some of that history in this book. And then there was my own history that I learned about in writing this book. So all of those go into making up the title of History Lessons. And I'm going to say one thing more about the book before I launch into another excerpt. My strategy in the book that sort of evolved as I was writing it was to try to capture as close as possible the thinking and the voice of the person I was, the child, the teenager, etc., the young adult. The book starts when I'm 2 years old, and it goes through till I was about 25, 26. And so in each part of the book, the narrator's voice changes in the book as I try to capture the thoughts of that child. I mean, there's also the narrator, the narrator, who comes in from time to time as well. But I think this is one of the things. You read the excerpts, you'll hear different approaches to thinking about what's going on. This next excerpt is called, I call it Union Man. If the boss gets in the way, we're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll right over him. If the boss gets in the way, we're gonna roll right over him. We're gonna roll the Union on. Grandpa Morris is a Union man. He sings as he steams oatmeal in the double boiler on the gas stove in our New York apartment. I'm 7 or 8 years old, waiting for my breakfast. His singing is more like chanting. He punctuates the chorus, swinging his right fist across his chest. My voice joins his. I swing my own little fist to roll the Union on. Grandpa Morris is always the first one up in our household. My mother says that when people get older, they don't need as much sleep. I haven't found that to be true. Before making breakfast, he's already nipped around the corner and come back with copies of the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, and the Daily Worker. 3 papers he and my parents read every day. Morris makes breakfast for the whole family on school days. When the hot cereal is ready, he scoops it into bowls, meticulously, evenly sprinkling sugar over the surface. And as we sprinkle, we sing. This is sprinkling sugar. Put it on the ground, spread it all around, dig it with a hoe, it will make your flowers grow. We spoon cereal from the edge of the bowl, digging a little trench just inside the rim. By the time we eat all the way around the outside, the rest of the cereal is cool enough to eat. I can't imagine what sprinkling sugar on cereal has to do with making flowers grow. But occasionally as I eat, Morris sings a verse of the old Union song. If you want a raise in pay, I'll tell you what to do. Go and ask the boss for it, and he will give it to you. Oh, he will give it to you, my boys. He will give it to you. A raise in pay without delay. He will give it to you. Oh, put it on the ground, spread it all around, dig it with a hoe. It will make your flowers grow. I get class consciousness along with my oatmeal every morning. A big event in our family every year was May Day Parade. And it was so important to me, I put it on the cover of the book. The cover is an artist's rendition of a photograph of a May Day parade from 1947. And I'm going to read you a little excerpt called Marching on May Day, 1948. May Day was a special holiday, just for communists, socialists, and union members. It was a day of active protest. I'm 8 years old here, by the way. We marched on May Day because we wanted free speech, fair wages for everyone, an end to racial discrimination, and especially peace. My father told me that tens of thousands would be marching in cities all across the United States to show our government that Americans wanted peace. My father would be leading the parade, marching with the Lincoln Brigade and World War II veterans. I was old enough to march with Margie, my mother, as part of the Harlem Upper West Side contingent. I was so anxious to get to the parade that I made us leave early. We waited an hour before seeing the first marchers. Coming down 8th Avenue were the Lincoln Brigade veterans in their U.S. Army uniforms. Margie and I pressed to the edge of the sidewalk. "That's my father," I shouted to everyone around us as they swung into view, with George and 3 other former officers out front carrying American and Spanish flags. I knew my father was a hero, and the crowd lining 8th Avenue confirmed it. Hundreds, probably thousands of people were cheering their hearts out for him and the other vets. May Day parades were not like other parades. There were no marching bands, no girls in cute red and yellow uniforms twirling batons, no fancy floats, no giant balloons, fire engines, or soldiers carrying guns. Instead, it was just thousands of people carrying signs and banners, singing and chanting. The banners told who they were. United Electrical Workers, Local 47, Teaneck, New Jersey, or ILGWU, International Ladies Garment Workers Union. A few hundred high school and college students passed us with a banner that said Labor Youth League. Margie leaned over and spoke into my ear. "You'll march with them when you're in high school." The marchers were all ages. I was happy to see quite a few children marching with the adults. Lots of people were carrying printed signs saying, "No more war," "End Jim Crow," "Win with Wallace." Every printed sign had a union label at the bottom. Many others carried handmade signs like "Our kids want peace," "Roll the Union on," and lots more I can't remember. Finally, it was our turn to march. Marching down the middle of 8th Avenue with police blocking the side streets was even more thrilling than watching my father march. We marched at the front of the Harlem and Upper West Side sections of the Communist Party. People lining the streets cheered as we chanted, "Jim Crow must go," and 1, 2, 3, 4, "We don't want another war," 5, 6, 7, 8, "We want Wallace in 48. I chanted as loud as I could, even though I didn't know who Wallace was. Later, I learned that Henry Wallace was the Progressive Party candidate for president. As we turned the corner to march east on 17th Street, my father, in his Army Air Corps uniform, surprised us by jumping into line with Margie and me. I felt secure and confident, holding both my parents' hands as we marched the last half mile to Union Square. As we chanted, "We don't want another war," I felt proud to be part of something much bigger than myself. The cheering by the crowds lining narrow 17th Street echoed loudly between the tall buildings. There was a huge crowd, tens of thousands at Union Square, more and more marchers arriving by the minute. The loudspeaker was blaring the voice of Pete Seeger. Seeger threw his head back, pounded his banjo, and sang out, "Now I hate Jim Crow, and Jim Crow hates me. That's why I'm fighting for my liberty. Hallelujah, I'm a-travelin', hallelujah, ain't it fine? Hallelujah, I'm a-travelin' down freedom's main line."
New England authors were recording on location in Jamaica Plain and broadcasting on stations throughout New England.
But this is something, the last excerpt I'm going to read is from my first day of high school. And it's give you a different flavor of something else of the period of the times. September 1953, the day after Labor Day, my first day of high school. Looking around me in the auditorium that first day at the Bronx High School of Science, I felt a strange mixture of excitement, confidence, and nervousness. I knew about a dozen students from ninth grade at Booker T. Washington, my junior high school. But everyone else was a stranger. The girl sitting next to me had prominent breasts, wore makeup, lipstick, stockings, and heels. I remember thinking, she's a grown-up. What is she doing here? I was 13 years old, suddenly aware of being younger than most of my classmates. Our first class was English. Our teacher was an earnest, slim, dark-haired young woman in glasses. She laid out her expectations for the year. This is a language class. We're going to read some of the greatest books and plays in English and American literature. We're going to write about our ideas and about our lives. And since language includes all forms of communication, we're also going to speak and listen. We'll talk about the books we read, about current events, about movies, anything we like. We're going to listen to each other, and we won't always agree. When we disagree, we'll respect each other's opinions. Sometimes we'll change each other's minds. Sometimes we'll become more articulate about our own points of view. Sometimes both. The most important thing I want you to know is, in this class, it is safe to say whatever you think. A hand shot up. There's a girl sitting 2 desks away from me who'd gone to Joan of Arc Junior High School in Manhattan, about a mile south of Booker T. I don't think that's a good idea, miss. It's not safe to say what we think. We have a boy in this class who writes letters to Senator McCarthy. Last year, he wrote to Senator McCarthy about 2 of our teachers. A buzz of silence filled the room. Everyone looked around. I could feel my stomach tighten as my eyes searched the room too. The students from Joan of Arc fixed their eyes on a bespectacled boy sitting 2 rows behind the girl who spoke up. Is this true? Our teacher appeared a little shocked. The boy raised his hands. I did write to Senator McCarthy, and he wrote back, commending me. McCarthy boy began hesitantly, softly, gradually raising his voice and becoming more strident as he went on. We had teachers who were spreading communist propaganda. One of them said Red China should be admitted to the UN. Another said he was opposed to loyalty oaths. They were spouting the Communist Party line, trying to indoctrinate us. No one else said anything. I thought someone should complain, so I wrote to Senator McCarthy. I wrote to him twice, and both times he wrote back to thank me for my patriotism. He sent me copies of Senate testimony proving that there are hundreds of communists teaching in the New York public schools, and I'm proud to say that one of those teachers is no longer at Joan of Arc. He was called before an investigating committee, and when he refused to testify under oath, he was fired. The conversation went hot and heavy for the rest of the hour. I don't remember exactly what was said, except that everyone who spoke attacked McCarthy boy for interfering with free speech, for creating a sense of fear. He stubbornly defended himself, repeating his evidence that he was right, the commendation from Senator McCarthy, and testimony the senator had sent him. I couldn't help thinking of my liberal junior high school English and social studies teacher. I had worshiped Mr. Lobenthal for his intelligence, humor, honesty, and for encouraging us to speak out. He made it clear that he was anti-communist but for freedom of speech. More than once he'd expressed the opinion that Red China should be in the UN. 400 million Chinese can't all be wrong, he'd said. What would have happened to Loby if McCarthy boy had been in his class? I said nothing, a knot growing in my stomach. All through junior high, I'd participated warily in current events discussions, asserting my beliefs cautiously, never being the most outspoken. I'd acknowledged that my parents supported Vincent Hallinan, the Progressive Party candidate for president in 1952, one of just 3 students who did so. The rest said their parents were for Stevenson and Eisenhower. I was convinced that except for 2 classmates whose parents knew my parents and agreed with them politically, no one in junior high school suspected that I was a communist kid. I sat silently with a knot in my stomach. Caution trumped belief. I was indignant about McCarthy boy, terrified of exposing myself, excited about the kids who were attacking him. Yet there was part of me that admired him for sticking to his guns in the face of universal opposition, something I was afraid to do myself. The bell rang, and we moved down the hall as a cohort to biology class. Mr. Weiss, a tall, sandy-haired man, asked what all the excitement was about. Several students clamored to tell him. Mr. Weiss fell silent for a moment and then said simply, "That makes me very sad," and passed out our biology texts. 3 weeks later, Mr. Weiss disappeared. Without a word of explanation, he was replaced by another biology teacher for the rest of the year. We never heard anything from or about him, but the rumor in our class was that he'd been called before one of those committees and that he had resigned rather than being forced to testify. Thank you.
Well, so good to have you with us, Dan Lynn Watt. Your book is called History Lessons, and it's fascinating reading about growing up in communist family. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.